4th Annual Urban Economy Forum was held in Toronto, Canada, as well as virtually. The conference, organized by the World Urban Pavilion in Regent Park, in partnership with the Urban Plus Future, was designed to assist urban policymakers and practitioners in achieving sustainable urban economy through practical approaches. This year, UEF4 focused on sustainable urban finance, and community journalists from the Focus Media Arts Center documented the workshop.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good afternoon.
And
And
good evening to all our participants around the world.
As
As Alex said, I'm Ananta Krishnan, the Secretary General of Urban Economy Forum, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to those attending the fourth session of the Urban Economy Forum in person and virtually.
The UN Habitat's World Cities Report estimates that up to 163 million newly poor people now live in cities and urban areas. They have lost their income, lack decent housing, and cannot access basic services. Cities and local governments play a key role in responding to the crisis. Cities are accelerators of economic growth. By making them more equitable, urbanization can also help distribute this growth. If city managers have the right tools, they can plan and take action to reduce the gap between the have and the have-nots.
And we are very excited that in such a short span of time, the UEF4 is taking place in this magnificent location, the home of creativity, innovation, and knowledge exchange in Regent Park. Urban Economy Forum's goal is to create a global conversation to rethink in a conceptual and operational manner about urban resources and urban economy. This year's main theme is sustainable urban finance. The forum aims to bring governments, cities, and other urban stakeholders together for transformative change. In this sense, it's a collaborative and participatory model of urban economy as a main driver to realizing sustainability.
Over the past 17 years, the Regent Park revitalization has clearly demonstrated the power of collaboration and of partnership, of a multi-sector, whole of community approach to creating inclusive and resilient communities. It has also demonstrated how cities can be the primary agents of change in the drive towards achieving SDG 11. Cities can and must become the engines of sustainability, affordability, accessibility, and resilience. Very specifically, Regent Park has clearly demonstrated, how political will combined with, yes, municipal financing tools can drive urban transformation. The experience is right here in this neighborhood.
The Jardin Group in the last 2.5 years have been, I feel that these last 2.5 years have been a strong reminder to us that the principles our organization was founded 122 years ago are more relevant than ever. And those are shared responsibility, commitment to the community, and cooperative growth. And the way I see it right now is that these kind of values will help all of us to really accelerate positive change around the world. And I am so humbled that I can attend this meeting with all of you today.
The world has taken too long to recognize the urgency of dealing with climate change. And we now have to back up this recognition with more urgent action towards greater sustainability, including where the majority of the world's populations live. Singapore has pledged and remains committed to a net zero transition. We approach this in several ways. First, through a redirection of public and private capital towards sustainable financing. The Singapore government will issue up to 35 billion Singapore dollars of green bonds by 2030 to finance green infrastructure projects. The green bond frameworks published by the public sector will align with internationally recognized green bond principles, standards, and best practices.
We all want good housing, decent jobs within an easy commute, efficient transport, excellent schools, modern health facilities, access to culture, parks and open spaces. And we want all of this to be affordable. We want to know that when we grow old, we won't live in poverty and that we can continue to enjoy a good quality of life. Will we be able to put the heating on, to visit the library, to entertain friends? Will our families be able to feed and clothe their children, to go on a trip to the theatre? The energy crisis and the cost of living crisis that has hit many countries hard has demonstrated the urgent need for sustainable urban finance. On the back of the financial crisis, the refugee crisis, the COVID pandemic, and the ongoing climate and ecological crisis, we are facing new and urgent challenges that require fresh approaches to sustainable urbanism.
This is a need to design a comprehensive system management tools with the BI platform for controlling projects and monitoring all of the operation layers of city that can integrate different urban criteria.
Cities and urban areas are the world's engine of economic development, and an additional 2.5 billion people will be migrating from rural to urban areas in the next 30 years. And this will require additional investment in urban infrastructure and compound the already very large annual urban investment gap of several trillion US dollars.
In my estimation and in our thinking, sustainability and resiliency are two of the most significant considerations that are to be the basis of our decisions and actions, as they are critical to our immediate and future development. It believes, while it is utterly important that we build urban sustainability and resiliency, our efforts are equally focused on strengthening our rural and peri-urban sectors to reduce urbanizations.
I must say that we are at special momentum that we are experiencing, especially now in Europe, more demanding challenges. It is about the energy crisis that speeds up. It also brings some creation and implementation about new solutions in spatial planning, housing, greenery, and also budgeting itself. But on the other level, it brings us, or makes us, or pushes us into a new way of thinking about budgeting and about gaining finances.
Let's imagine that the economic goods that are needed here would be optimally brought about in efficiency terms by central government imposing something horrible on the people of the local area. The forcible selling of their organs, for instance. Now this approach, let's call it the horrible approach, could well be sustainable in the sense of being able to be maintained, as long as enough people kept being born and so on, but clearly the fact that the horrible approach within our thought experiment would optimally bring about the resources necessary to provide universal local access to adequate housing, transport and so on, clearly that would not justify such an approach being enforced by the central government. So one of the reasons for this is that the horrible approach would not only be against, pretty obviously, against the overall interests of the citizens, it would also violate their rights in various ways. It would violate their rights in the obvious sense of violating their bodies. But the state here would also be failing to recognise that people are agents with the right to determine their own ends.
Ladies and gentlemen, the development of cities and their surrounding areas is strongly influenced by technological change. During the pandemic, in a short period of time, we learned to use teleworking tools and video meetings. Distance education became more common in schools and universities, and in general, the importance of location decreased substantially.
we're here to discuss relationships between public and non-public organizations, not just financing organizations, but also other sorts of private or non-public organizations in financing sustainable urban development.
If we had issues that were persistent and present in our cities, many of them were definitely made a lot worse with the pandemic. And in Toronto, for example, one of the things that we realized was our shelter systems. And before the pandemic, it would cost about $4,000 an evening to shelter somebody in our shelter system. And we have every given night about 9,000 people. And the pandemic hits, we had to create more physical distance. We had to rent hotels. It is now costing us about $6,000 a night.
For the international audience, I think it's also important to understand that Concordia is part of a very large higher ed ecosystem in Montreal. Together with Boston, Montreal has the highest concentration of higher ed institutions per capita in North America. And in August, the Chamber of Commerce in Montreal released a study indicating that Montreal's universities bring more than $4.3 billion in direct economic benefits to the city as a result of our expenditures. So I think the point I want to make is that universities everywhere are engines of economic activity, and that's why I believe there's an opportunity to focus attention more intensively on how the operations of universities can contribute to sustainable finance initiatives.
The single most crucial factor impacting sustainable urban financing is bridging the gap between cities and the private sector. Cities are the economic engine of the world. They currently represent more than half of the global population, 80% of global GDP, and by 2050, close to 7 billion people will live in urban areas, much of which is still to be built. This translates into one of the biggest investment opportunities of the next decades. Based on a recent white paper we created with systemic, even conservative estimates, suggests that business opportunities related to more sustainable cities could be worth over 3.7 trillion annually for the private sector by 2030.
What happens if multifamily construction takes off while single family falls behind, or vice versa? What happens if lenders only want to finance certain types of product? What if land prices increase or decrease? How do local governments make efficient policy decisions when what makes the most sense in 2019 may not make the most sense in 2021 or 2025?
There's a shortage of housing, and part of how we develop the estate and how previous generations have developed the estate is to make sure that for the longer term there's a balance in the uses.
But the role of not just private finance, but particularly institutional capital is crucial for sustainable cities. And one of the reasons, because the solutions are often capital intensive. So you require a long-term investment in substantial assets. You require the capital to invest in research and development and technology. And we find that to be quite well suited for multi-year drawdown fund structures that you would see in private market asset types. So private equity, real assets and infrastructure and real estate typically. With the advent of ESG, it's become increasingly important that we are able to partner with our clients to help them navigate the space and that we can identify credible investment opportunities for them. So one of the things that we do is we maintain a pipeline of ESG and impact funds that are fundraising in the market, and we see a range of different approaches and different strategies. The sustainable urban element to this often comes across in terms of both environmental and social aspects in terms of these targets.
I worked for 4 years on a project that was funded by the Volvo Research and Educational Foundations that was doing case studies of sustainable transportation transformations in sustainability through the lens of transportation. And what we did in that project was focus more on the move beyond the what, because in a way everybody in here knows what needs to be done.
But the question is, how do you get it done? So we were moving to the focus on how, which meant implementation, which of course meant governance and a variety of stakeholders, not just the private sector, mayors, citizens, elected officials, citizens at many different scales. So what we did is try to take some of the insights. Oh, and I would mention that the policies that we looked at in the VREF project were all very different because all the countries we looked at were very different. So we studied how it was possible to get congestion charging in Stockholm, but in New York City we looked at pedestrianization of streets. In Mexico we looked at BRT. This is a point I'm going to come back to with our panelists. All cities are not alike. We will make that report available through UEF about kind of how to share knowledge, how to learn and share knowledge on a global scale about the most important challenges that are connected to sustainability. But there were I would say 6.5 underlying assumptions in the project. One was that the economy and the environment are connected and need to be treated as such. Second, the local is not independent, and many other scales need to be considered when addressing equity as part of promoting a holistic approach. 3, SDG 11 is not the only important goal for cities, but it's a strategic starting point for centering the urban within a larger SDG agenda. 4, conflict in implementation is inevitable, and it's important that that remains visible. 5, focusing on the how, this is the main point, is crucial to achieving sustainability, and that means moving beyond, these are my words, a best practice mindset to learn from everyday struggles and challenges. The 6th principle is activating change requires working with long-standing partners and new allies. And I guess I would just say the 7th point was that all cities are not alike. I really want to highlight the global north versus the global south. There are poorer cities and richer cities, and all cities are embedded in different political, economic, and social contexts.
I want to just situate the conversation. Prior to coming to the House of Commons as a member of Parliament, I was a city councillor. And I was tasked with looking at the symptoms of decades of really poor land use and urbanization within the province of Ontario. You know, as a city councillor, I had the opportunity, in fact, to attend Quito for the Habitat 3. And out of that conference, of course, what was identified in 2016 was war, catastrophic climate change, and urbanization as being the 3 major themes that we would ultimately face. And one of the things that I tried to do as a city councillor in looking at sustainability and understanding the constraints of municipal governments in Canada, I would share with you that in Ontario, for instance, we are really susceptible to suburbanization and suburban encroachment onto our agricultural fields based on the simple fact that municipalities are only funded 2 ways. They're funded through building permits and property taxes. We are, in fact, the beneficiaries of gentrifications in our municipal centers. And this is where I'm going to tie this together from the federal to the municipal. Absent of any direct controls, real meaningful controls on the way in which organized crime, money laundering, and corruption are active here in Canada in our housing market, we can forget having any influence at the municipal level. In fact, municipal levels of government are often the most heavily influenced by big developers in terms of the way in which elections are financed. We're in a municipal election right now, and with the inability for staff really to adequately defend against the onslaught of capital and the wholesale commodification. I'll give you 2 examples and then I'll close. You know, in Hamilton, we're talking about mobility, but the way in which our public transit is potentially being sold off or privatized through Metrolinx and the LRT is a big problem. That sometimes the things that we think are solutions for sustainability end up driving inequality and driving the financialization of our public goods. And the second piece, particularly as it relates to olding and aging infrastructure, when you look at the way we expand into the suburban settings, we're never able to recoup that costs, and it leaves municipalities, of course, with things where we have combined stormwater systems, which in Hamilton resulted in a catastrophic flood of sewage going directly into our harbor.
I am the Vice President of Innovation and Partnerships at Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC. My team in particular, what we do is we really focus on bringing new and existing participants within the housing sector together to understand problems very holistically. So we want to understand it from all the actors and everyone who is impacted or involved in a particular problem. And then we want to co-develop solutions together. Our mandate is to help improve housing conditions, so housing, but also living conditions in Canada. To accomplish this, we created a very ambitious aspiration. We aligned it very deliberately with the timing of the Sustainable Development Goals. So our ambitious aspiration is that by 2030, everyone in Canada has a home that they can afford and that meets their needs. And so what I want to do is maybe just talk about 3 ways that we're really looking at sustainable finance in helping us achieve this ambitious aspiration. So one of them is through the National Housing Strategy. So this is a pan-Canadian 10-year strategy. $72+ billion have been invested in it. And it's a plan really to give more Canadians a place to call home. The other thing around the National Housing Strategy, though, is we're a national organization. It is intended to cover the entire country. As you know, Canada is a very vast, very diverse country, and we're dealing with very distinct needs, even here within one country, from the far north to our big cities, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. And one of the things that we learned very quickly, and we learned it through trial and error, honestly, is that even within one country, a consistent or pan-Canadian approach doesn't work. And just one final example is with regards to, so actually here in Toronto, one of the things that we're working on is how can we support the deep climate retrofit of an existing affordable housing building while minimizing displacement of the current tenants and avoiding rent increases. And so we're looking at different processes, funding mechanisms, and partnerships that would really enable that. So it's one challenge I'm sure many people are experiencing across the country.
I was listening to all the speakers now very, very carefully, and I'm really tempted to talk about the Vienna model of social housing because I think it's an explanation how you can really do something about the whole aspect that Matthew was mentioning, the negative effects of financialization, of gentrification. But with regard to finances and governance, I would like to raise one aspect. That is that how can we really secure stable city budgets? And stable city budgets are very often composed of, and that's also coming into the multi-level governance I mentioned that Diane was referring to. Stable city budgets, they don't fall from heaven. At the same time where we need to account for the climate change. So all of these issues cannot be done without cities. And one of our main causes at the moment on European level is really to set for a strong urban agenda on European level in all policy fields. Because we cannot rely, many cities in Europe cannot rely on their national government when it comes to getting the equal share out of the European budget. My last word would be about whenever we discuss all of this, whenever we discuss taxation, security of city budgets, reliable public services, something the mayor of Kingston was very much pointing out, we also need to discuss this from the gender perspective. And we have to look at all of these aspects from a gender perspective. If you have great public transport, you will also see, this is a study we also did, better labor participation of women from certain areas which have been disconnected before. So my wish to the mayor of Kingston is that, yeah, go for that public transport campaign, because it will also help your women and it will empower the women in your city. Thank you.
My name is Masoud Ganchi from iPro Capital, which is a real estate investment company. Sustainable urban finance is a kind of critical phrase. as the concept of sustainability is a fundamental requirement for the future of our life on Earth. In parallel, as we are talking about financing sustainability, and in the literature and identity of finance, we are always talking about the benefit and risk factors and a clear, transparent business strategy and plan for implementation. As people want to have a sustainable future on Earth for the next generations, we should not be depleting these much-needed resources, as this is the correct strategy for the long term. While we also try to provide solutions for this kind of change, we need to utilize the available resources to support the sustainable urban development agenda and obtain resources from the government and so on. Otherwise, many of the current business models would not be aligned with this urban paradigm shift. Regarding the language and literature of this kind of change, we should create a specific language for investment and try to mobilize new and untapped resources for this kind of approach and try to facilitate an interactive dialogue between different investors. This is a unique area. For example, if you want to work on this kind of concept, you need to understand that this is a new and fundamental concept regarding sustainable urban finance. We can try to create a new diagram that includes public benefits at its core, yet still be able to have benefit sharing with the investors. Although creating this multidimensional model is difficult, it is doable, as creating better lives for everyone is a demand from the civil society. In this model, we are trying to involve and create a specific project and involve some of the financial institutions and encourage other potential partners to create this new room for investments. We will try to create a kind of win-win outcome for the public sector. We understand that there are three critical questions that I would like to emphasize on. First, regarding the concept of sustainability, which is an ongoing concept that is developing day by day. People in the academic area are trying to enrich this concept. We are expected to make the shift to sustainability immediately, or will it be kind of a process? Second is who's responsible for providing flexible solutions and enabling new technologies for sustainable urban finance? The private sector or the private? Whose responsibility is it and based on what amount? Finally, are we able to provide a kind of fundamental tool for realizing sustainable urban finance in a realistic background of cities? I hope we can all collaborate in this specific project and provide fundamental solutions and get the job done.
We need a new deal with our provinces. We are creations of the province. We are the major drivers of the economy as cities, especially big cities, and yet we do not have the fiscal tools to secure our destiny in a good way.
So the key point here is we're seeing kind of these multiple threats superimposed now on what was already a situation of chronic underinvestment in urban services. And so increasingly the goal of finance in cities, of sustainable urban finance, needs to be on how you can meet multiple goals at once. It's not just climate finance to invest in projects that reduce emissions. It's how can you meet the goals of lowering emissions, reducing inequalities, building climate resilience, ensuring well-being and economic prosperity. Sounds like a tall order, but all at once.
Impact is the impact of your company's products and services on the world. ESG is the impact of the world on your company. You really need to manage both. If you care about making the world a better place, you want to have products that are impacting the world, that are either reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, or they're improving our end-of-life issues, or they're improving quality of life for people. They're providing affordable and sustainable housing, etc. And the concerns within an urban setting are very high.
Now, we're heading towards something of a fiscal cliff in Toronto. The real estate market, of course, can't always be in a boom, but we've become very reliant on meeting our tax obligations with those funds. One of the first things I did when I moved from government into the private sector was try to find a small builders group, was going to make a coalition. The big developers have their associations. I was going to find the people who wanted to build 4-plexes and 6-plexes and make a lobbying association for them. They just didn't exist. And, you know, to today, I still think there needs to be more ways of supporting those kinds of groups to get started, because we need them. And the existing folks at the table can't solve the problems alone.
We are in a golden age of capital availability. As we want to work together as public and private sector parts of the community, I think there is real willingness and availability of capital on the part of the private sector, but it requires the public sector to come forward with pretty well-worked schemes in order to be able to induce that capital.
Part of what is so important with the conversation that you held today is specifically the fact that the City of Toronto is facing a $857 million deficit right now. We are not funded. Yes, I know, Professor, thank you. You looked up when I said that. So the city is actually hitting this fiscal cliff that our speakers have spoken about, and we've already deferred $300 million worth of infrastructure, which means community centers are not going to be refurbished, that parks will not be built, roads will not be repaired, and at the same time we're looking for answers. So your conversation on what's happening today is so critically important. Keep the dialogue going, and regrettably we don't have an opportunity for Q&A, but you have the speakers' bios. Please look them up, stay in touch, and feel free to shoot them a question or two, and you can also nab them while they're here. If you have a question, I'm sure they would be very happy to answer it for you. So thank you very much, and the opportunity to moderate today.
There's sort of 3 key pieces of community wealth. The first thing is to harmonize this idea of economic development and human development, that they don't actually exist in separate spheres. They can be harmonized all together, and that we have to look at sort of a holistic model for community wealth building, or for building sort of sustainability in communities, and that's that marriage of the two things. And that community wealth is meant to benefit communities. It is built and designed to benefit communities, particularly those communities of equity-deserving groups, which is why Regent Park is the place that we chose to start this work and to really test this model of community economic development. And the third major thing is that we need to shift the system. The system, as we know, many of our systems are challenged and experiencing lots of stress in the current world, and that community wealth building is meant to shift the system, and it's meant to shift the system for positive economic and human impact on a long-term scale.
Our financial institutions are really not serving our needs right now. And one of the things I noticed by even just in this conference is that there are a few financial people representing financial institutions, but there really needs to be a lot more. What we really need to be doing and encouraging is more community-based initiatives to be developing really innovative community-based mechanisms and institutions that could be really profoundly changing the way that we make decisions right now.
I will just going to share with you the social development plan. So the social development plan is a plan that was put together by a lot of folks involving government, organizations, and residents. This was a plan that talked about how will this community live? How do we continue to live together? Is there a plan that looks into community building? Change cannot happen without you. You need to advocate for these changes, and you cannot wait. So my message to you and the world is change lies with all of you and holding people accountable. And there are people who are ready to help, who are ready to partner up, but it cannot be championed alone.
And I'm going to ask my friends to share the infographic if they can. And I just want to point to the fact that we were able to deliver over 10,500 meals in a span of 30 days. We engaged with hundreds of volunteers. We're in the midst of what our elected officials earlier talked about was revitalization or gentrification. Earlier, we heard from elected representatives and other policymakers talk about the impact of austerity, right? We feel that directly on the ground, right? When those programs are canceled, when those investments are not happening, it's the residents, it's the folks living in this community that feel it the most. And one of the things we're doing right now is we're pushing for not just community benefits, which many of you might know of, but accountability and transparency in the way those community benefits are delivered. Making sure that the residents of Regent Park, making sure that the community is at the forefront of the co-development, co-design, and the co-implementation of a community benefits plan.
Kitchener has also been actively working towards creating a sustainable urban forest, setting short-term and long-term canopy targets, and continuing to plant more trees by the end of this year and beyond. These steps embraced public consultation, which included feedback from residents on our 2023 to 2026 strategic plan, the first 4 years of our next 20-year vision for the city, as well as any actions that we have taken throughout the years in the localization of the SDGs.
When you try to create a multi-sector table of corporate, community, and government, each works at their own pace. And so you've got the president of BMO or the president of a global construction company that is used to being able to move things quickly. And I think what we need to work on is working at the pace of community, which is at the pace of trust. And that often takes time, and that takes relationship building. And it's not directly linked to the amount of dollars you invest in that neighborhood. It's directly linked to the relationships you've got. And so what we've seen is for this public-private partnership to work, each group needs to recalibrate its speed, its outcomes, and the measures of success so that we can move forward collectively.
A question from Vaishali Kushan, actually, which has been sent to everybody, but I'm going to, well, it's a comment, but perhaps something that you can expand on and comment on. She states, the diverse challenges in a technology hub that has seen a strong economic growth and innovation while grappling with major issues, including homelessness and high cost of living. So how to best invest for a new future and the implications for new companies and old ones. Is there anything that you would like to add or respond in that regard?
So I'll jump in, and then I think the mayor of Kitchener, I see his friendly face, so I'll leave it for him as well. But in terms of, look, I think it's the flood analogy all over. I think given what we're experiencing with the cost of inflation globally, we have got to continue to ensure people can keep a roof over their head and food in their fridge and be healthy going to work. But we have got to identify the structural and systemic root issues that got us here. We don't have a deeply affordable continuum of housing to meet the needs. And so if we are going to build 75 towers in the greater Golden Mile, which is, by the way, larger than the scale of Regent Park that we are in now, we've got to find a way through policy and government and corporations to ensure there is deeply affordable housing for our most vulnerable. Otherwise, any discussions about inclusive communities are just rhetoric. If we can't care for our most marginal in basic and systemic ways, we are just paying lip service to public and private partnerships and not putting our mouth where our heart and soul needs to be.
In Cuba we don't have the homeless issue per se, but we have like multiple generations living in the same house, which is a big issue sometimes, and always or most of the time leads to the creation of informal settlements within areas that has high risk to climate change. and it also has high social vulnerabilities. So I only would like to agree that we have to work with the community to find a solution that solve all these social but also climate vulnerabilities, because in the case of Cuba, they have tried, for example, to displace them to most safe areas, and the only result is that new families come to this area.
While we have talked about public-private partnership and the involvement of the private sector, which is very important, one issue that has certainly come up from the experience of PPPs in the West, including UK particularly, with the private finance initiatives, etc., and particularly in terms of the question that Vishali put, which was with regard to investing for a new future and being more inclusive and homelessness issues and affordable housing. And that is that, in fact, private sector, let's say, has had the challenge to address some of these social inclusion issues, particularly affordable housing. And the attention now is turning more towards, certainly in UK, of greater direct involvement of the public sector and local governments in going back again to invest in social and affordable housing directly.
Making sure that there is enough housing, but also that there's the enough types of appropriate housing, particularly the deeply affordable and the supportive housing, is key in order to deal with some of the challenges that we're facing around homelessness. But that requires an all-of-community solution in terms of dealing with these issues. No one order of government is going to be able to solve these problems on their own. We need the federal government to come to the table, particularly in terms of investments in deeply affordable and supportive housing, and things like the Rapid Housing Initiative that stemmed out of the National Housing Strategy have been a big step in the right direction, but we need more of it quicker.
Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit that little bell notification. And don't forget to check us out on all our social medias. And if you want to see more, check our website.
Thank you.